I'm really happy to see you here. We've just started a recording, so to keep that in mind as you stay on the session. We're here to show you a preview of some of our new material on neurodiversity inclusion in the workplace. I think we can go straight into the next slide. Tell you a little bit about who we are, LCW, Language and Culture Worldwide. We have been around for about 20 years, a little over almost 25 now, actually. Our mission is around cross-cultural understanding. We want to help different communities work better together, be kinder to each other, understand each other, and we're working towards an ultimate goal of equity in the communities where we work and live. And so what we do concretely is we work with leaders, teams, and organizations to build the skills and mindsets and systems that you need to succeed in a culturally diverse environment and to achieve what we call sustainable inclusion, which we believe is the outcome that you need culturally to meet your goals as an organization, to achieve your bottom line, and if you're a nonprofit, to achieve the mission that you set out to achieve. So we are global and we're focused on culture as a kind of core concept for understanding human difference and leveraging that difference to the greatest benefit of all in organizations. A little bit about me. On the next slide, I'll just introduce myself. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I studied organizational culture, and I've been working in the intercultural field for about 20 years, particularly in organizations around the employee experience and corporate culture and the talent management cycle. And have developed expertise over the years in this thing that we call sustainable inclusion, which is how to develop a culture where everyone feels like they can contribute, where everyone knows that their ideas matter, and where we can see past things like stereotypes and unconscious bias and really understand people for who they are and get that authentic contribution from all of us. I'm also a neurodiverse or divergent individual. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go through this session. But one of the things that we do at LCW is we present these cultural spotlights, which today is one. You can go to the next slide. And the cultural spotlight, we always strive to present a spotlight on a particular culture from someone who's from that culture. So as a cultural native of the neurodiversity community, I'm here today to share this material with you. And what we do in these cultural spotlights is we look at a particular facet of human difference, such as neurodiversity, could be race, could be gender, could be sexual orientation, some of those more classic diversity categories. We're expanding and into different communities all the time. So we have new material, of which this session is one. And what we like to do in these sessions is do a snapshot. We have also cultural immersions, which are half-day sessions, which really do a deep dive, but into particular communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we define community in a little bit. And so today, again, I'm going to share with you snippets of or excerpts from our neurodiversity spotlight. And I want to start with this quote from an author, Aurora Levins-Morales, who says, "There's no neutral body from which our bodies deviate." Because if you think about the term neurodiversity, implies that there's a norm from which we diverge, which is true, right? It's true to a certain extent. There is definitely a majority of what we call neurotypical way of being in the world and way of your brain's way of being in the world. But there's also a spectrum, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means and how it manifests in the workplace. But I wanted to throw that quote out to you as a starting point to think about. It's something to think about. What's normal, right? How do we get to normal? How do we define what's normal? So that's a question for consideration. All right, so let's jump into the next slide. And I do want to say also, before we get into the subject matter, I'd love for this to be interactive. Please feel free to unmute yourself, interrupt me. I have no problem with that. If you say, hey, I have a question about what you're saying, or if you have a comment, want to share an experience, I'd love to hear it. We want this to be interactive and informative. So we're happy to build community as we go. So I want to start off with just giving you a little bit of context about kind of how we're talking about neurodiversity in in the media these days, and here's just a smattering of recent headlines just from North America talking about from Mexico to Canada, even down to South America, some things that are going on. So, for example, the first headline there from a Mexican publication talks about how there's been some research from Mexican statistics organizations to find out there's more than 700,000 people that consider neurodiverse in the Mexican workforce, and that business leaders are recognizing the importance of this talent pool that has been overlooked. So it's being thought of as a new talent pool. So that's one aspect of the context. Another aspect is from this Forbes article, thinking about, are we tapping into this talent pool in the right way? So, for example, this Forbes article talks about how employers are focusing on folks who we call low support needs. So folks who are already able to function to a certain degree in neurotypical situations or society. Whereas we're not maybe tapping into other sub-communities within the neurodivergent community, folks, for example, who don't speak, but maybe need a little more support, but what is the benefit that we can reap from that community? So, questioning, we're doing good things, but are we doing enough? There's an article that talks about people's experience in the workplace, and I'll get into that more in a little bit, in a few more slides. An interesting article from Brazil about the potential consequences of not accommodating folks with neurodiverse needs. This is a story about a woman who was moved to a very noisy call center and was not able to perform. And so she ended up suing because she told her employer about her needs, and they were not, her requests weren't granted. And so she ended up having, issues, mental health issues or consequences of being in that environment that wasn't okay for her. And so, and then, other kind of trends here about how we're realizing that there is a lot we can gain from employing neurodiverse folks in the workplace. So I'd invite you to come off mute and maybe share an experience or what you're hearing or talking about, maybe one of the reasons why you joined us here today, just to kind of, gauge how this context is sitting with you all today in your present situations. So I'd love to hear from you if anyone has anything to share. Feel free to come off mute or share in the chat if you prefer.
Hi, Sarah. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yep.
My name is Steph Small. I'm the DEI director for Group M Canada. So
Yes,
you're aware. Okay, so we're the largest media agency in North America.
Yes.
And currently I'm working in collaboration with someone at our holding company, WPP, in the talent and recruitment department around specifically how to help our neurodivergent talent. We're developing training for our managers. And so this is why I joined the call today. He unfortunately couldn't be here. And so what we're finding is similarly with the big push subsequently from Amazon mandating their workers to come back full time. We are currently working in a hybrid model, but coming out of that conversation, the news with Amazon, there are discussions about also following that pattern in mandating all staff to come back to the office. And so my partner in work and I are talking about how that working model doesn't necessarily work for everyone, as we see, and as you shared your example about that person in Brazil. And so we're developing, I guess, our business case, if you will, to say, this is all well and good that Amazon wants to do this, but unfortunately, in this day and age, and now that we are more aware and acknowledging that that model doesn't work for everyone, and more specifically, the neurodiverse community. And so I'm hoping from this call, we can kind of get some more talking points and more facts. And I love this slide with all these headlines about what it's like for those working in the workplace and how we can accommodate them so that they can be successful in their jobs.
Yeah. No, great. Well, I'm really happy to see you here and would be happy to follow up with you privately at your leisure. I think that's great. And you know, we're going to go into some more detail about people's experiences and the concrete things that we can do in a little bit. So it'll be hopefully of use to you. And I did see the comment about your supervising your first openly neurodiverse employee. So you want to learn as much as possible. So great. I hope you will learn some concrete things today. And again, would be happy to follow up with you, you know, individually afterwards. All right. Well, feel free to keep sharing your experiences. Anyone, I will keep going. We'll go to the next slide. But at any time, feel free to drop a comment. All right. So let's throw a question out to you. A little quiz, see what our thinking is. What percent of people are considered neurodiverse in the world? Take a guess. One of these answers is correct. Which one is it? You should see the poll pop up and just take a moment and choose which you think is the correct answer. Is it 3 to 8, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, or 33? Oh, Carolyn says she's not seeing the poll. I can see it, so that's strange. It should pop up on your screen, like right in the middle. Can everyone else see it? Okay. All right, others can see it. So let us know, Carolyn, if you can't. All right, cool. You might have to click on more, the little 3 dots to see it. All right. So I'm not seeing the answers quite yet. All right. All right, so we have the results. So it's pretty evenly split. The answer, drum roll please, is 10 to 20%. So somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 of the folks that you run across on the street are neurodiverse, or considered outside of that nebulous norm that we don't really define, but we sort of know that it's there because it's what the majority is like, right? So that's a lot of people. That's not a small percentage of people, right? If you think about your workforce, that's a significant number of folks, right? So it definitely behooves us to understand it better. So now let's go to the next question on the next slide, which is which of these conditions is considered neurodivergent? So you can populate that. And I think you can just hit the slide one more time so the options come up on the slide as well. There you go. All right, so which of these is considered neurodivergent? And let us know, always, so when you have all the responses, you can share them. All right, so 89% of you answered the correct answer, which is all of the above. These are all considered neurodiverse conditions. I myself am someone who, the main condition that I deal with on a daily basis is called misophonia, and it's I would say extreme sensitivity to certain types of noises. It's extremely debilitating. And I've suffered from it my entire life, and it's many people in my family have it. And I didn't know that it was actually a condition until the year 2012, which isn't that long ago if you consider I'm in my mid-50s, where I saw a news article about it, but that it had a name. And I'd never known my whole life that I had this thing. I thought I was the only one who had it. Turns out a lot of people have it. And they put me on all types of medications and stuff to try to deal with it, but there is no treatment for it. You have to learn to cope with high sensory output. You have to learn to manage it. So I can talk about those coping strategies. But of course, misophonia co-occurs with things like ADHD, which I'm in the process of getting diagnosed for. And so there's a lot that goes with that. And so I'll talk about my experience as I go through this training, but know that within the neurodiversity community, another thing about it is that we're all different, right? Every one of us experiences these conditions a little bit differently. I've met lots of people with misophonia since discovering what it was and joining some, support groups online and things like that. And I know that there's a lot of similarity in the things that we experience. Definitely creates a community. We'll talk about that too. But there's also a lot of diversity too. So it's as you would expect it with humans, right? We're a lot of things in common, but we're always very different from each other. So that's not an exception with the neurodiversity community. All right, so all of these conditions are considered neurodiverse or part of the neurodiversity spectrum. If anyone has any questions about particular ones, feel free to ask. And let's move on from here and go to the next slide. So now I want to just share with you the learning objectives of the actual spotlight. So some of the things we've just been talking about are the lead-in to how we would introduce the topic. These are the 3 learning objectives of the actual 1-hour session. First, we want to provide definitions, models, and vocabulary for understanding and talking about this phenomenon. So frameworks and culture is the main framework. So I'm going to talk about that right up next. Then we want to understand, because we look at this as a cultural experience. We want to understand what are the shared cultural experiences of people who are in this community. And then finally, and importantly, learn strategies for creating inclusion, which I know we're all here to kind of learn about. So those are the learning objectives that you will benefit from if you want to have this session with your employees or with your leaders. So let's get into the first part, which is the definitions and models. Those of you who know LCW know that we look at things through the lens of culture, which is wonderful for me as an anthropologist, because of course I'm thinking this is the correct way to do it. As an anthropologist, culture is our model that we look at, that we use to understand human behavior. If you think about it, you as a human being were born not knowing how to do pretty much anything. And culture is where you learn to do everything. And we learn, for example, what's normal. We learn that through our culture. The values, the way we look at the world. So our worldview, what we consider to be right, good, normal. Those come from culture. And then we translate those values into behaviors, things that we do because of the things that we believe. And the communities that we learn these are communities of birth, communities of origin, like you're born in a country, in a region, in a city, to a language, to a culture, whether it be an ethnic culture or religious culture or combination. And then there's communities of adoption. You decide to go maybe you change religions, maybe you go on a certain educational path, a professional path, you become a musician, you're diagnosed with a condition called misophonia, right? And then all of a sudden you're part of other people, a community of other people who share those experiences and influences. The other thing about culture is that the values and behaviors, you can see what people do, but you can't see what they believe. And so typically we judge people by the things we see, and we get it wrong because we're not matching it up with the values that come underneath. And so that's, of course, an important way that we get things wrong when we're dealing with folks who are different from us. And so that skill of understanding other cultures is what we work on at LCW. And so all of that to say that we look at this community through the lens of culture. And so let's look now at how the community of neurodivergence or neurodiversity kind of came to be. It's a historical origin story. This is just a small snippet of the story to give you an idea. It's not an extensive timeline by any means, but if you think about like over a century ago now, when IBM was founded, and Herman Hollerith, who was on the autism spectrum, became very influential in creating one of the most influential organizations of all time, I would argue. But he wasn't considered neurodiverse at the time. There was no label like that. It took 100 years after he worked in the world for us to create that label or to come up with that kind of way of categorizing that way of being in the world. So one of the first things was a book by a person named Temple Grandin, who talked about their experience being labeled autistic, called Emergence. And then you have organizations emerging, like the Autism Network International. Judy Singer coins the term in 1998. And then, you know, things kind of progress from there. You have certain, you have entertainment, you have disability, kind of neurodivergence being woven into disability as in the what we call the medical model, which I can talk about too. And then, you know, bizarrely, we were still treating people, autistic folks, with electric shock treatment up until 2020, which I find incredible. So it just shows that this is a recently defined community. 50 years ago, you wouldn't necessarily think of this as a community, but now we can see that there are shared experiences, common influences that create a community. And so because of that, we can think about neurodiversity in cultural terms, and that helps us handle it on a day-to-day basis. So let's think a little bit more about shared experiences and common influences. If you go to the next slide, this is some of the stuff that happens to neurodiverse folks in the workplace. And I'll speak mostly to my own experience here, although there's much more that could be said about people who have different conditions from me. The label versus individual, a lot of folks will talk about how if their condition, I hate the word condition because it implies that something's wrong with you, but if their neurodiversity is known by others, that people might not see beyond the label and see the other things that that person brings to the table and the other ways that that person can contribute or even just be. So not wanting to reduce yourself to a label sometimes prevents people from coming out, so to speak. Another thing is that in the workplace, I would say this is probably true, at least in Western Europe, North America. I don't know so much about Asia and other parts of the world, but I would say definitely in the North Atlantic culture, social interactions are super important. We tend to favor the extrovert, and for folks like me who are extremely introverted, have a lot of problems with hypersensitivity, that can be extremely difficult. And especially if you don't really realize that that's what's happening, you can start to feel like you're just not good enough, or you're not you're a failure at being in the workplace. Whereas what's really happening is that you're drained more easily than other folks, and so you have to really manage your social interactions. Masking and mimicking. Obviously, masking is about hiding what's going on. I'm a master at that. Just yesterday, Elisa, who's also here, and I were at a conference in town in Chicago, and this happens every conference you go to. Little bags of chips that are given out as snacks, and that is extremely difficult for somebody with misophonia to manage. But I think anyone looking at me yesterday at the conference, I had to get up and stand in the back of the room so the noises wouldn't be behind me. Nobody would have been able to tell that I was doing that, or to tell that I was freaking out because of those noises, and totally unable to focus on what the speakers were saying. Because I'm good at hiding it, because I had to be good at hiding it, because it's not something that people understand most of the time. Mimicking is something that doesn't really apply to my conditions particularly, but it can be a way that folks try to mask by just kind of copying what other people are doing to fit in. So that can be something. Yeah, I see your comment, Stephanie. Yeah, you don't want to be negatively labeled. And I'll tell you, not even their closest friends know. That is absolutely true. They're not everyone in my life knows that I have misophonia. And I'll tell you one reason why. It's just with this particular condition of misophonia, I've had the experience in my life that whenever I tell people about what it is, they laugh. They laugh, and then they say, "Oh, you mean like this noise?" And then they'll like crunch an apple or make that noise. It's so strange, and I don't think people do it out of malice, but it's I think it's just because maybe they're incredulous. It is a kind of strange type of, if you don't know about it, you'll think the person is just there's no way that you could be bothered by that. That's just weird, right? But it's true. We're very bothered. So yeah, it is rude, but it's happened to me and other people that I know with misophonia. They've had that experience too. So I think it's something about how it's received, that information is received, that just surprises people. Sensory overload. This is a huge one for someone like me and for someone, well, lots of people who have many of the conditions that I listed on that previous slide. I don't know if you all have noticed this, but I feel like the world has gotten noisier over the last 5 or 6 years. Everywhere you go now, there's a TV, there's music in every lobby. It's too much. I live in a high rise in Chicago, and I noticed, I think 4 years ago now, they started playing music in the lobby. And there are times when it makes me break down into tears because I've had a long day and I come home and I love music. I'm a musician. I love music. I listen to music constantly. But when it's forced on you, it's something different. And I don't know how many people can like relate to that, but sensory overload is a huge problem today in our common spaces. Another thing is, you relate. Yes, I think it's really hard to manage. Going to the grocery store, I cannot go to a grocery store without headphones that play white noise. I cannot. Between the beeping, the music playing, and people with wrappers and plastic bags, I will have a meltdown within 7 or 8 minutes. So, yeah. Routine and change is another really big thing. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about accommodations, but things like being able to find your way places or knowing who's going to be around you so that you know what kind of noises are going to be around you, or just routine sometimes is something that neurodiverse folks really need. So having to change, like, for example, when you have hoteling, which is a thing, and now with, speaking of going back to the office, right? I'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide, but it's a big thing to think about. And then just remembering that neurodiverse folks are also, intersectionality is this idea that we're not just one thing, right? Our cultural identity is a complex layering of things. So someone can be suffering from multiple marginalizations at the same time. If you're Black, female, gay, and you have ADHD, there's a lot for you to contend with in the workplace. There's a lot of ways that you are not the norm, right? That you are faced with dealing with on a daily basis. So we just need to keep that in mind, that people are dealing with a lot. And the more accommodating that we can be and the more understanding we can be about where they're coming from, the better off, the better we're going to be able to work together, right? Sensory overload, especially after a long day. Yes, it makes managing emotions and everything so difficult. I totally agree. And another thing I learned in researching for this session and for this course is that emotional dysregulation is a feature of many of these neurodiverse conditions. And having an emotional meltdown, I used to think it was a failure. That if I had a meltdown, that means I was failing in life and I was immature. You know, it's not true. Actually, meltdowns are there to help a person who's dealing with these situations regulate. It's a regulatory mechanism. And once I learned that, I thought, oh, that's good to know. I mean, not that I enjoy having a meltdown, but if I do have one, I don't have to feel like I'm failing or that there's something wrong with me. I just have to realize that I've been pushed to the brink, right? And this is what happens when you get pushed to the brink. So you do it. You have your meltdown and then you feel better. So that's pretty good to know. All right, let's go to the next slide and talk about some of the shared values. So given everything I've just told you, and given, you know, this quote from the Harvard Business Review here that says that it's 15 to 20, we saw 10 to 20. So somewhere between 10 and 20% of the world's population has something going on, right? What do you think some of the values of this community would be now that you've sort of been able to see it as a community? What are some of the shared values we might have? So drop some insight into the chat or come off mute and share what you think, and then we'll we'll show you some that are from the research. Okay, yes, empathy, definitely. What else? Equity, yes. Being concerned for equitable outcomes and inclusion, definitely. What else? Compassion, yeah. Advocacy, excellent. Yep. Anything else? Curiosity to understand and learn, definitely. Yes, all of those are correct. Self-determination, yes. All right, so let's show the survey says. It's a Gen X reference, TV reference. Acceptance of difference. So we as neurodiverse folks know that normal is just a concept, right? So we know that people are going to be different. As I mentioned before, even within our own community, like I meet people with misophonia and I'm not going to assume that my trigger noises are the same as theirs, although a lot of us have many of them in common, but some are very different. So with that comes the knowledge that there's an infinite number of adaptations and accommodations that may work, right? And so knowing that we need to be creative with that. Reframing, goes with self-determination, right? And even with compassion. I mentioned the medical model earlier, so just to give a tiny bit of context, the medical model is looking at disability and neurodivergence as a medical pathology. So in that paradigm, you're thinking, well, there's something wrong with me, right? Whereas in the social model of disability and neurodivergence, it's more like, there's nothing wrong with me. It's society that isn't adapted to me. And that's an example of reframing, right? Is saying, I'm not, as someone with misophonia and ADHD and restless legs and a few other things, I'm not pathological. I'm not defective. There's a spectrum of normalcy and I'm over here, whereas the majority of people are here. That's all. But doesn't mean anything's wrong with me. And so we're good at reframing these ways of looking at ourselves so that we find our dignity and our worth, because society would, maybe not on purpose, but just put us in a category that makes us feel like there's something wrong with us. So reframing is a big thing that we do. Self-determination, someone actually said that, motivation and perseverance. So we know that things are going to be tough and we keep going and we take care of ourselves. So those are just some general common shared values that you may find in the community. Again, knowing that there are no monoliths in culture. That's the one constant about culture, is that it's always changing. It's not a bounded, impermeable thing, but it's always changing, and people are going in and out and adding to it, and it's a living, breathing thing. All right, so now let's get into some of the nitty-gritty of what do we do. So let's go to the next slide. Barrier. So this gets into looking at the barriers and how we can remove them. So first barrier is in the attitudes, right? So we talked about this before, labeling people, assuming that you need to behave in a certain way to be a good performer, having set expectations or stereotypes or assumptions about folks because of a label. So that we can address through training, through discussions, through work on the corporate culture. Environmental, so back to some of the more practical things. If you're thinking about bringing people back into the office after being away from working remotely, remember that you can't have one size fits all if you want to accommodate your neurodiverse folks. You're going to have quiet rooms and more than you think. Hot desking in open spaces. So I mentioned this earlier. It's very difficult for some people to have a different desk every day. My personal experience is I've lived in the same town for 20 years and I still can't find my way around. I cannot find my way around. And in a big office space, having to navigate corridors, oh my gosh, that is so stressful for me. So stressful. And so much so that I'm embarrassed even about how stressful it is. Like if someone says, so, like anytime I'm visiting a client and we're in a big like facility where you have to walk down corridors and take a left and take it, where's the bathroom? And they say, oh yeah, go down here and take a, I'm in a panic. There's no way I'm finding my way back. It's like I have to leave breadcrumbs because I just have no sense of direction whatsoever. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about setting up hoteling or hot desking, because it's really difficult for some people. And by the time they've found their desk for the day, they're burnt out. They can't work. At least that's how it is for me. It only takes that half an hour of total panic, not being able to find where you're going, to kind of short out your whole energy for the day, right? And then, of course, there's institutional barriers that can come up. You know, even policies like everyone has to come back to the office every day. That could be very detrimental. So things to think about as you're trying to plan how to accommodate people from this community. And the term ableism is kind of like a catch-all for these attitudes and these barriers. Because it's just this, whether it gets to the point of discrimination or not, it's the attitude or just looking at the world through the lens of able people, neurotypical people as the default, and not recognizing that there's quite a good percentage of folks who don't fit into that default, right? All right, so then the next slide here, I think, get us into some even more practical things. A quick quiz. Here's a list of 6 or 7, 8 practical things you can do. Which of these would be considered reasonable accommodations? I'm thinking about US law here, Americans with Disability Act, but there could be other legal systems in which these might be considered reasonable accommodations as well. So how many of these would be considered reasonable accommodations, do you think? Let us know your thoughts. And then when everyone has voted, we'd love to see the results. All right. All right, good. Y'all are on the ball. 92% said all of the above. That is correct. All of these are considered to be reasonable accommodations that an employer might make. So B is my favorite, adjusting work area to minimize sensory triggers. Silent mouse. Has anyone ever heard of a silent computer mouse? I only have them in my house. I made everyone in my family get one, and just it costs the same as a regular mouse. It's absolutely no cost, right? You're gonna have a mouse, you may as well have a silent one. Now, I know people who like the click, but I can't. And I know a lot of people like me who can't deal with the click. So that's just one small detail, but you'd be surprised at the effect that it can have on a person. Also C, this is one that often gets brought up in intercultural work, because if you go to places like, I lived in France for 10 years and I used to work in the French corporate environment, and culturally in France, it's more acceptable to be late to a meeting. People don't start meetings on time. There's personal stuff that gets talked about at the beginning of meetings. It's a little more relationship oriented. I'm generalizing, but that was my experience. Whereas in the United States, it's more task oriented. It's rude to be 5 minutes late. It's not rude to be 5 minutes late in France necessarily. So those of you who are French on the call will disabuse me of that if you think I'm wrong, but that again was my experience. So sometimes these things can be cultural too. And for neurodiverse folks, I know for like me, one of the things that I realized in looking at my ADHD is that I am a late I have a tendency to be late, and that is something that happens to folks with ADHD. So an accommodation might be to have a policy where, you know, we have a buffer zone. We have a 5-minute buffer zone at the beginning of a meeting. That's just something to consider. Yeah, Stephanie, I agree. When you start meetings before the scheduled time, I think sometimes people do, okay, sometimes that can be a good thing because people can join early for personal, as time to like connect, which I think is a great thing to do. However, starting before the scheduled time kind of excludes a certain group, right? And so it's a way to be inclusive sometimes if you want to have that personal time, but if the fact of starting early is what excludes others, then that doesn't exactly work, right? So maybe have the check-in, the personal check-in, but have it be for the first maybe 5-10 minutes of the meeting so that people who are coming in late are only missing that, right? Any other comments about any of these reasonable accommodations? You know, I will note also the working from home flexible schedule is something to consider as you all are thinking about that back to the office move. That maybe one size fits all doesn't work for everyone.
I just want to make a comment about something that's somewhat feedback that I got recently is I'm a part of I'm a part of the onboarding process at the agency. So I give a DEI, just quick high level overview.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very self-aware in that I know I speak fast at times, especially if I'm nervous. Fun fact about me, people that know me, I don't like public speaking at all, but I have to do it. It's part of my job.
Right.
Uh, and so when I get nervous, I speak really fast as I'm just trying to get through it and get it over with. And so I've added closed captioning to when I'm presenting in PowerPoint, whether it's virtually or in office. And I had no idea someone needed an accommodation and they were a new hire. And during the meeting, or sorry, after the meeting, they had actually pulled me aside and thanked me for doing that. They said they've never seen that before. And they asked me if it was something that I did because of my accessibility. And I said, no, it's just a thing that I do because I speak fast and I just want everyone to understand what I'm saying and get everything that I'm saying. And so I never thought about it, but now I'm more conscious when I'm doing presentations. I now send out a note saying, does anyone have any accommodations that we may not have considered so that we can make this as inclusive an experience as possible for everyone. And
Fantastic.
it wasn't something I would have thought of beforehand. And so
Right.
maybe just, a little tidbit, an anecdote is just maybe to do that if you are doing a presentation, whether it's to your clients or your vendors or your internal employees, because you'll be surprised at the feedback that you'll get and people will say,
Yeah.
actually, yes. And to your earlier point, some people are just afraid to speak up about it because they don't want to be an inconvenience or they don't want to be singled out. But if someone kind of extends the hand and says, I'm trying to help you, help me help you, that may open up the doors for people to feel more comfortable and be able to show up.
Exactly right. It's exactly right. It's just taking that first proactive step, whether you know that there's a need for it or not. Just assume, you know what? That's a great idea. Just assume there's a need, right? Just assume there's a need and accommodate it. You send out that note saying, hey, if anyone has any needs, feel free to send me a note individually, or, I think that's a great idea. Excellent. Any other thoughts? About accommodations or barriers or experiences? We are coming up on the end of our time. I want to leave you with a final thought, which if you go to the next slide, you'll see. Normal, as I said earlier, is a concept. And this quote is not really anonymous. It's from my mom. She used to say this all the time. Normal is just a setting on a washing machine. And she found a magnet and she put it on her washing machine. It says that. And I think that's a great way of thinking about it, right? It's like there is a majority right, in every population, and there are majority trends, but there's also diversity in every population. And so I think it's a great way of kind of just approaching our workplaces, right? Is that, we have a norm, but we also definitely have a range of not normal, so to speak. And so we need to be very proactive about accommodating those folks. Thank you for coming today. I will stick around and love to hear any more comments or experiences that people have. Please take a moment to scan that QR code and let us know what you thought. And we would be delighted to